There is a name that connects Donna Summer and Michael Jackson, and it isn't either one of them. It's a producer, one who, in the very same year, was shaping the sound of the reigning queen of disco and quietly laying the groundwork for the album that would make Michael Jackson the biggest pop star on the planet. Most fans of either artist have never noticed the overlap. Fewer still have asked what it meant for Donna Summer to be standing, professionally, in the same room as the man about to change pop music forever. It is not a story of rivalry or friendship, but something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing about how the music industry of that era actually worked behind its glossy public image. To understand it, you have to look past the finished records and into the credits, the calendars, and the studio bookings that rarely made it into any magazine profile of either star. By 1982, Quincy Jones was already one of the most sought-after producers in the industry, having shaped Michael Jackson's Off the Wall in 1979 into a landmark of disco-inflected pop and R&B. Jackson, still finishing his transition from child star to solo powerhouse, was deep into recording sessions with Jones for what would become Thriller, an album still more than a year from release, its eventual scale not yet obvious to anyone involved, including Jones himself. According to those who worked in the industry at the time, the sessions leading up to Thriller were treated as an important project, but not yet as the cultural earthquake it would soon become. Jones was, by his own later reflections, focused on craft and detail rather than on any sense of history in the making, treating the sessions as another demanding, ambitious project among many. At almost exactly the same moment, Donna Summer was navigating one of the more turbulent stretches of her own career. She had left Casablanca Records, the label that built her into disco's most recognizable voice, and signed with Geffen Records, a fresh start at a moment when disco's commercial dominance was fading fast in the wake of the cultural backlash that had followed events like Disco Demolition Night. She needed an album that could prove she was more than a genre now widely declared dead by much of the industry press. The stakes, by most accounts, were real. Without a successful reinvention, she risked being permanently defined by a sound the culture had already begun to move past. Signing with Geffen Records was itself a statement of intent, a decision to seek out collaborators who could push her sound somewhere new rather than simply repeating what had already made her famous. It was in that context that Quincy Jones came to produce Donna Summer's self-titled 1982 album, Donna Summer. The pairing made sense on paper. Jones had a track record of pulling artists across genre lines, and Donna Summer had never been purely a disco singer in range or ambition. But the timing meant something more specific. While working with her, Jones was simultaneously deep in the sessions that would define Michael Jackson's sound for a generation. Few outside the studio walls at the time would have guessed that these two very different reinventions were happening under the same producer's direction. Only months apart, Jones has since been described by collaborators as someone who moved between projects with remarkable focus, giving each artist his full attention without treating one as more important than the other. According to those familiar with the production landscape of the era, working with Quincy Jones during this period meant working inside an ecosystem of musicians, engineers, and creative decisions that moved fluidly between projects. The same studio culture that was refining the crisp, propulsive sound Jackson would ride to unprecedented commercial heights was, in parallel, being applied to reshaping Donna Summer's sound for a post-disco landscape. Neither artist was working in a vacuum. They were, in a very real sense, sharing creative oxygen without ever needing to share a stage. Session musicians, arrangers, and engineers moved between projects as a matter of routine, carrying ideas, techniques, and even specific sonic textures from one studio booking to the next without much public notice. It was an invisible infrastructure shaping far more records than most listeners ever realized. The album that resulted, Donna Summer, included the hit State of Independence, a song notable in its own right for assembling an enormous supporting cast of background vocalists. Among them Michael Jackson himself, alongside Stevie Wonder, Kenny Loggins, and other major names of the era. It was a rare, direct point of contact. Michael Jackson's voice, however briefly, layered into a Donna Summer recording, produced by the same man who was about to make Jackson a global phenomenon. For a song built around a message of unity and hope, the gathered voices behind it made the track feel, in hindsight, like an unintentional snapshot of an entire era of popular music standing together in one room. None of the participants, by most accounts, treated the session as historic at the time. It was simply another day of work among professionals who respected one another's talent. That detail, Michael Jackson singing background vocals on a Donna Summer track, has remained one of the more overlooked footnotes in both artists' catalogs, rarely mentioned in retrospectives of either career. It surfaces occasionally in liner note trivia or completist fan discussions, but almost never in the larger cultural narrative of either the king of pop or the queen of disco. Two of the most commercially dominant voices in American music on the same recording, produced by the same hands that were about to make one of them immortal. Music historians revisiting the credits decades later have occasionally flagged the detail with surprise, treating it as a small piece of trivia rather than the meaningful crossing of paths it actually represents. Streaming-era listeners scrolling through credit metadata are often the ones who stumble onto it first, long after either artist's more famous chapters have already been thoroughly told. The two artists' commercial paths, however, diverged sharply within months of that overlap. Thriller, released in late 1982, would go on to become the best-selling album of all time, propelling Michael Jackson into a level of global fame with few historical precedents. Donna Summer's Donna Summer album performed respectably, but did not replicate the commercial peaks of her Casablanca years, and disco itself continued its retreat from the center of American pop culture. The same producer, the same year, the same creative circle, and two dramatically different outcomes. It is the kind of divergence that makes for an uncomfortable question. How much of pop stardom comes down to talent and timing, and how much simply comes down to which cultural wave an artist happens to be riding at the moment the world is watching? Both had immense talent and the same caliber of producer, yet only one stood at the front edge of a cultural shift the public was ready to embrace. It would be easy, looking back, to frame this as a story of who won and who didn't. But those close to the industry at the time have described it differently, not as a competition, but as two parallel careers passing briefly through the same orbit before continuing on very different trajectories, shaped as much by shifting cultural tastes and label strategy as by anything either artist did in the studio. Donna Summer was not chasing Michael Jackson's success. She was trying to prove disco's queen could survive disco's decline on her own terms. That distinction matters. This was never a race between the two of them, even though history, in hindsight, has often been tempted to frame it that way. Reducing it to a competition flattens what was actually a more interesting story. Two artists at very different career stages using the same producer to solve two very different problems. What makes this quiet overlap worth revisiting is not that it changed either artist's trajectory, but that it reveals how tightly interconnected the music industry of that era actually was, even between artists rarely mentioned in the same sentence. Genres that seemed worlds apart in the public imagination. Disco's fading glamour and the sleek new pop sound Jackson was pioneering were, behind the scenes, being shaped by many of the same hands in overlapping rooms during the very same months. The audience rarely saw any of this. All they experienced was the finished product, seemingly born from entirely separate musical worlds. Donna Summer rarely spoke publicly about this period in terms of her connection to Michael Jackson specifically, focusing instead on her own reinvention and the challenges of rebuilding a career while an entire genre collapsed around her. But the overlap remains there in the credits, in the background vocal list of State of Independence, in the shared producer's calendar for 1982, a quiet, factual thread linking two towering, seemingly unconnected careers. She let the work speak for itself, by most accounts more concerned with her own reinvention than with drawing attention to who else happened to be in the room. That restraint, whether deliberate or simply a byproduct of her focus elsewhere, is part of why this connection has stayed so quiet for so long. In the decades since, as both artists' legacies have been endlessly examined, this particular intersection has remained a footnote rather than a headline. Overshadowed by Thriller's scale on one side and by disco's dramatic commercial collapse on the other. But for those who look closely at the actual production credits of 1982, the connection is undeniable. For one brief overlapping window, the Queen of Disco and the future King of Pop were, in the most literal sense, working with the same hands in the same rooms toward two very different futures. It is a footnote that deserves to be read as more than trivia, a genuine crossing point between two of the defining musical figures of the 20th century, hiding in plain sight for anyone willing to read the fine print of a decades-old album sleeve. It is a reminder that music history rarely divides as cleanly as genre labels suggest. Behind the glittering surface of disco and the sleek new sound of 1980s pop stood the same small circle of producers and musicians, moving between projects that seemed, to the public, to belong to entirely separate worlds. Donna Summer and Michael Jackson never needed a rivalry or a headline collaboration to be connected. The connection was already there, quietly, in the credits all along, waiting for someone to notice it.